Well, while there is no firm report yet as to who's responsible for today's attack, it's speculated that militants from the Northern Caucuses are involved. Now, this is definitely not the first attack in recent history in Russia. Just last March, suicide bombings were carried out by 2 women on the Moscow metro system, where at least 40 people were killed. But does terrorism from the Northern Caucasus remain a threat only to Russia, or are there more widespread ties with a global network? Here to discuss it with me is Dr. Walid Phares, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Dr. Phares, thanks for coming in again.
Thank you.
Now, first, I think that we have to talk about something that I think often there is perhaps a misunderstanding, and that many people automatically say that it's Chechen terrorism and Chechen militants when there are these issues in Russia. But let's talk about the Northern Caucasus region in general, Dagestan, these other areas where we've seen trouble come from recently.
Well, number one, in America, in the West in general, and in large segments of the international community, there is a confusion between what is an ethnic conflict, what is a secession, what is a local politics on the one hand, and then the violence produced by these forces way beyond these regions, including, as we saw in Moscow and elsewhere. And that confusion is basically not good for the understanding between the international community. In the past, we've seen jihadi forces operating out of Chechnya. We know that Wahhabi elements came from the outside, or some of them were trained in the outside. But now we see it, as you just said, going across the Caucasus, into Dagestan, into southern parts of Dagestan, but also across the Caspian Sea, into those cells of jihadists who have been coming from Afghanistan. So what we see right now is not just a local issue that has to do with ethnic politics. We see really international terrorism here.
So that we definitely see ties with international terrorism, with, I don't know, perhaps Al-Qaeda as a whole. I mean, is there definitely, evidence that people from Dagestan, from the Northern Caucasus, have been to Afghanistan and Pakistan, in those tribal regions to train in these camps?
You have 2 types of evidence. The government-backed evidence, that is the intelligence services of Russia, or of the international community, or of NATO, or of Pakistan, or of some of the Arab and European countries who are telling us some individuals, we've seen them in other parts. Now, what they were doing, we'll have to wait for the evidence to materialize. What is probably for experts more important, or as important, is basically the websites who are expressing the views and the actions and the incitements and mobilizations, such as the Kafkaz website, but many other Salafi, jihadi websites. They designate a whole part of their activities to those operating in the Caucasus. So that tells us basically that it is now transnational jihadi.
Now, if we do look specifically at the Northern Caucasus, what do you know about Doku Umarov? Because he took over after, Shamil Bistayev, and there was a lot of reports that there was sort of a split in the faction last year between he and some of his lieutenants. So is there a lack of a leader here, too, at the moment?
From the inside of the chat rooms that basically talk about these issues, it's like the small talks among the jihadists over the past year or so. There have been talks about disputes between Umarov and some of his lieutenants, or called the emirs of the region, on 2 issues. One of leadership, which is very normal in these factions, but the other one is on the strategy to use. While some lieutenants are talking about conducting these strikes within the confine of Chechnya or Dagestan, and not go beyond that into what they call the infidel land, that's Russia or Ukraine or elsewhere, and those who are saying, no, we're going to take the action all the way to Moscow. And I think the faction that is behind the action today, belong to those extremists.
Now, because Russia had in the past hunted down so many of its leaders, I think that we can say that there are a few differences, because Russia also has made, a very strong campaign, as they say, to hunt down these leaders, that they know where they are, as opposed to perhaps we can say Osama bin Laden. We still have absolutely no idea where he is. It's been, 10 years now. But does this prove perhaps that you don't necessarily need this figurehead, that they aren't really in charge every step of the way?
Let's make a very short comparison with the United States confrontation with Al-Qaeda and with the jihadi movement that goes with it. Remember that we in the United States claim that we depleted large segment of Al-Qaeda leadership. I mean, 4 years ago, we didn't talk, or 5 years ago, we didn't talk about Al-Awlaki. Al-Awlaki re-emerged. We didn't talk about Al-Baghdadi. Before him, you had the Zarqawi. I think there is a similar situation happening in Russia, and it's not independent from what's happening worldwide. When the Russian services goes after the immediate responsible for actions, they eliminate one generation. Then you have the next generation. So that leads me to believe that what's behind that renewal are forces with money and otherwise trying to indoctrinate. We are seeing now a younger generation of jihadists coming, not just from Chechnya, but from a wider place, and possibly people who have been trained in other parts coming back to do the jihad in Russia.
Now, you mentioned, of course, as we were just talking about Umarov and some of his lieutenants, that there's people are disagreeing when it comes to tactics, the type of tactics that are used. Why is it that suicide bombings do target innocent bystanders and civilians? Why don't they go for, the power structures of these infidel lands as they see it?
Look, this is a tactic. Suicide bombing is a tactic, and therefore it follows a logic. It's not a doctrine by itself. I mean, we practice only suicide bombing. In the cases that we've seen before around the world, of course it began in the context of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, Hamas, Islamic Jihad. In the 90s they used them, and they used them against buses, against cars, and Hamas realized that that would alter its international image. They changed tactic. We see it now around the world. I mean, in Pakistan, in Iraq, even in Saudi Arabia, in Somalia, almost a daily recurrence of suicide bombing, but they have a goal, and that goal is to intimidate civil society and intimidate the governments. This is terrorism.
So, I mean, I think the one thing that we can definitely learn from today is that it seems that there needs to be more of a globally coordinated effort if we can make so many ties between all of these networks.
Well, Alona, on this show with you 6 months ago and before, we just discussed that, and it was the first time I spoke about the necessity for at least the 5 members, permanent members of the Security Council, the 5 of whom have been attacked by any form of Al-Qaeda and others, to sit down and talk about the establishment of a UN-sponsored agency that does the coordination worldwide, because Russia alone, America alone, India alone cannot pull it. And on the second level, very important, to work together against radicalization, against the rise of this extremist ideology.
Well, Dr. Phares, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.